In the freezing capital of Minsk, a heavy silence fell before dawn. It was the kind of silence that comes before storms, the kind that hides fear, tension, and betrayal. Inside the presidential compound, Alexander Lukashenko sat alone, staring at reports that no leader ever wants to see, reports that confirmed his worst nightmare. Several of his most trusted generals had turned against him. For nearly 3 decades, Lukashenko ruled Belarus with absolute power. He called himself the protector of the nation, the man who saved it from chaos after the fall of the Soviet Union. But now, chaos had returned, not from foreign enemies, but from within his own army. Across the city, armored vehicles moved silently through the streets, checkpoints appeared overnight, and the national flag was replaced by the red and white banners of the opposition in several regions. The betrayal was no longer a rumor, it was a fact. Lukashenko had always believed that loyalty could be bought with fear. For years, he kept the generals close with privileges, wealth, and influence, while crushing dissent among ordinary soldiers. But after the war in Ukraine, everything changed. Belarus found itself trapped between Moscow's ambitions and the West's sanctions. Lukashenko had allowed Russian troops to use Belarusian soil as a launch pad for attacks on Ukraine, hoping to secure Vladimir Putin's protection. Instead, he brought destruction to his own doorstep. Young Belarusian soldiers watched as their country became a pawn in someone else's war. They saw their people suffer while their leaders lived in luxury. Slowly, resentment grew in the ranks. The generals whispered to one another in secret meetings, each conversation carrying the weight of treason. "Enough," one of them reportedly said. "He has destroyed our future. We must act before Belarus is lost forever." By the time Lukashenko's security forces discovered the plot, it was already too late. Communications from several military bases had gone dark, and the generals had gained control of key strategic positions. The Ministry of Defense building was surrounded by troops loyal to the rebellion, while the National Television building, once the mouthpiece of Lukashenko's propaganda, suddenly stopped broadcasting. On social media, videos appeared showing soldiers tearing down portraits of Lukashenko and declaring allegiance to the Free Belarus movement. Crowds began to gather, cheering and waving flags that had been banned for decades. For the first time in years, hope filled the streets. But so did fear. No one knew how far the president would go to hold on to power. Inside his bunker, Lukashenko raged. He called the generals traitors, foreign agents, and rats. He ordered the KGB of Belarus to arrest anyone suspected of disloyalty. Helicopters circled over Minsk as rumors spread that the president had fled the capital. Government officials appeared on television, their faces pale, trying to convince the public that everything was under control, but the truth was impossible to hide. Videos leaked from inside the army showed chaos, confusion, and divided loyalties. Some soldiers refused to shoot at their fellow citizens. Others defected, joining the rebellion. The country's fate was now being decided not in government halls but in the streets. By midday, explosions rocked the outskirts of the capital. Eyewitnesses described scenes of panic, civilians running for shelter, smoke rising from military bases, and gunfire echoing across the frozen fields. The rebellion had officially begun. Yet even as the fighting intensified, there were signs that not all rebels agreed on what should come next. Some demanded Lukashenko's resignation and free elections. Others wanted a complete separation from Russia and a new pro-Western government. Meanwhile, Moscow watched in silence. Putin's advisors held emergency meetings, debating whether to intervene. Russian troops stationed near the border were placed on high alert. The Kremlin feared that the fall of Lukashenko could spark similar uprisings across its own allied states. International reaction was swift. The European Union called for restraint and offered mediation, while NATO monitored the situation closely. News outlets around the world flashed breaking headlines. Belarus on the edge of civil war. In neighboring Poland and Lithuania, refugee centers prepared for thousands of Belarusians fleeing the violence. Yet within Belarus itself, communication was collapsing. The internet was shut down in several cities, phone lines jammed, and journalists detained. Still, brave citizens continued to stream live footage from their phones, showing the world a country tearing itself apart. As night fell, Minsk was a city divided. Rebel forces controlled parts of the military district, while loyalist troops guarded the presidential palace. Fires burned in the distance, hospitals filled with the wounded, soldiers and civilians alike. An old woman was seen crying near a destroyed apartment block, whispering, "We just wanted peace." For years, she had lived under Lukashenko's rule, watching neighbors disappear after protests, watching elections stolen and voices silenced. Now she watched her city burn. Meanwhile, inside his secret command center, Lukashenko prepared for a final stand. He called his most loyal commanders and ordered a counteroffensive. Tanks rolled through the night, crushing barricades and dispersing protesters with brutal force. But something was different this time. The people were no longer afraid. In one neighborhood, hundreds of civilians stood in front of the tanks shouting, "Belarus belongs to us." The soldiers hesitated. Some lowered their weapons. Others joined the crowd. It was a moment that could change everything. The rebellion spread beyond Minsk. In the cities of Hrodna and Brest, local police surrendered their stations without resistance. In Mahilio, rebels seized control of a state television transmitter and broadcast a powerful message. This is not a coup. This is liberation. Belarus is free. Millions watched secretly through VPNs and satellite signals, tears in their eyes, afraid but hopeful. For the first time in decades, they dared to dream of a future without fear. Yet Lukashenko was not ready to give up. He reached out to Moscow begging for help. In a tense midnight phone call, Putin promised support but warned that Russian intervention could spark a full-scale regional war. Lukashenko, desperate, gave permission for Russian peacekeeping units to enter Belarusian territory. The next morning, convoys of Russian military vehicles crossed the border. The rebellion's leaders realized the window of opportunity was closing fast. They had to act before foreign troops arrived. Street battles intensified. The sound of machine gun fire echoed through empty streets as rebels fought to hold their positions. In one dramatic scene captured on camera, a young Belarusian officer stood on a rooftop, waving the red and white flag and shouting, "Freedom for Belarus!" Moments later, an explosion threw him to the ground. The image went viral across the world, becoming a symbol of courage and resistance. As the conflict dragged into its third day, food supplies began to run low. Banks were closed and ATMs emptied. The internet blackout left people disconnected from their loved ones. But despite exhaustion and fear, the resistance grew stronger. Underground radio stations broadcast messages of unity. Do not give up. This is our moment. Even some members of Lukashenko's inner circle began to doubt his leadership. One former minister anonymously told journalists, "He has lost control. He is fighting ghosts." Belarus will never be the same. Internationally, diplomatic pressure increased. The United Nations called an emergency meeting. European leaders demanded that Russian forces withdraw immediately. Meanwhile, U.S. intelligence confirmed that several Belarusian generals had secretly reached out to Western officials seeking asylum and protection in exchange for information about Lukashenko's regime. It was clear the dictatorship was collapsing from within. By the end of the week, Minsk was barely functioning. Electricity was unstable, supplies scarce, and the streets filled with both hope and despair. Rumors spread that Lukashenko's private jet was spotted at an airbase near the Russian border. Was he escaping? No one knew. The government denied it. But even his loyal supporters had begun to vanish. On social media, the hashtag #FreeBelarus trended globally. Protesters across Europe lit candles in solidarity. Then, on the seventh night, something unexpected happened. The National Army's chief of staff appeared on a live stream, flanked by several officers. "President Lukashenko is no longer in control," he announced. "We are establishing a transitional military council to restore peace and prepare for democratic elections." The announcement triggered celebrations across Belarus. People poured into the streets, crying, hugging, waving flags. Fireworks lit up the night sky. For a brief moment, it seemed the nightmare was over, but the joy was short-lived. Just hours later, Russian armored columns entered the outskirts of Minsk. The new council called for restraint, but the Russians demanded surrender. The fragile dream of freedom stood face to face with the cold machinery of war. The next few hours would decide whether Belarus would finally break its chains or fall into an even darker chapter of its history. As dawn broke over the smoldering city, Lukashenko's voice appeared on state radio for the last time. "I have not abandoned my country," he said in a trembling voice. "I will return when Belarus needs me." The transmission ended abruptly. No one knew where he was. Some claimed he had fled to Moscow. Others believed he was captured. Whatever the truth, his era had ended.